The first time I heard the screams, I thought someone was being murdered in the darkened halls of the Sydney Opera House. It wasn't just a scream, it was layered, guttural, and inhuman, like multiple voices shrieking in agony at once. My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen at my security desk, the vast empty lobby stretching before me, every shadow seeming deeper than before. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound cut off. Silence, a thick, suffocating silence that made my ears ring. And that was when I realized my shift had only just begun. I worked the night shift at the Sydney Opera House. It's a job most people wouldn't take, and those who do never last long. The grandeur of the place during the day turns into something else entirely at night, something wrong. I was warned about this on my first night. The supervisor, an old man named Graham, handed me a laminated card with 7 rules printed on it. His hand trembled as he passed it to me. "Follow these to the letter," he muttered. "No matter what happens." I thought he was joking, just some creepy initiation for new hires. Then I read the rules. Rule number 1. If you hear singing from the main hall, do not enter. It is not a performer. Rule number 2. The mannequins in the costume department must be facing the walls before midnight. If any are turned toward you, leave immediately. Rule number 3. Do not answer the backstage phone after 2:33 a.m. There will be no call logs, and the voice on the other end is not human. Rule number 4. If you see a woman in a red dress standing on the upper balcony, avoid eye contact. If she notices you, run and do not stop until you're outside. Rule number 5. Never touch the grand piano in the rehearsal room. If you hear it playing, you have exactly 30 seconds to leave that floor. Rule number 6. If you find a door that wasn't there before, do not open it. Walk away immediately. It leads somewhere you do not want to go. Rule number 7. If Graham tells you to clock out early, do it. Do not argue. Do not ask why. Just leave. I laughed. I really did. Right in his face. "You're messing with me, right?" Graham didn't laugh. His eyes, shadowed and sunken, just stared past me, as if looking at something only he could see. "You won't be laughing for long, kid." I wish I had listened to him. My first night was uneventful. Boring, even. I made my rounds, checking each corridor and storage room, listening to the distant echo of my own footsteps. The opera house felt eerily vast when it was empty, the architecture too grand for the silence. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a soft humming from the main hall, a creak from the balcony above, but I chalked it up to an old building settling. It was on my second night that I broke a rule, and that was the night I realized the horrors in this place were real. It was 2:34 a.m. when the backstage phone rang. I was in the security office at the time, watching the static-filled monitors, fighting to keep my eyelids from drooping. When the shrill ring echoed through the silent halls, I jumped. Without thinking, I reached for the receiver. Then I remembered rule number 3. I froze. My hand hovered over the phone. The ringing continued, sharp and insistent. I swallowed hard. "It's just a phone," I told myself. "Just a dumb prank." I picked up. For a moment, there was nothing, just a cold, empty silence. Then, breathing. Shallow, rasping, like something struggling to inhale through a crushed throat. My skin prickled. "Hello?" I whispered. A pause. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "You shouldn't have answered." I slammed the phone down so hard the receiver cracked. My heart pounded. I stood there, staring at the phone, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The air felt thick, heavy, wrong. And then, in the security monitor reflecting the hallway behind me, I saw something move. A shape. Tall, thin, standing just outside the office door. I spun around. The hallway was empty, but the monitor still showed it standing there. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a glitch in the cameras, but when I returned that night, Graham was waiting for me at the entrance. "You picked up the phone, didn't you?" His voice was tired, resigned. I opened my mouth to deny it, but stopped. His expression told me he already knew the answer. I nodded. Graham sighed. "It knows your voice now. Be careful, kid. This place doesn't like rule breakers." I wanted to ask what it was, but part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. That night, as I walked the silent halls, I felt it, a presence just out of sight, following, watching. And when I passed the rehearsal room, I heard the piano. A single note played over and over. I checked my watch. 3:02 a.m. Rule number 5. I had 30 seconds. I ran. The sound of my footsteps pounded in my ears, but no matter how fast I ran, the piano kept playing. A single note struck again and again like a warning or a countdown. My breath came in sharp gasps as I barreled down the empty corridor, the grand architecture of the opera house twisting into something menacing in the dim glow of the emergency lights. I didn't dare look back, not even when I felt the unmistakable sensation of something right behind me, close enough that I swore I could feel its breath on my neck. I reached the stairwell just as the final note rang out. My hand slammed into the metal railing, and I half stumbled, half leapt down the stairs. The air behind me shifted, a sudden unnatural stillness, like something had been cut off mid-motion. I kept running, down, through the twisting backstage halls, past storage rooms where costumes hung limp like skinned corpses, through the loading dock where the air smelled of stale dust and something fouler. I didn't stop until I reached the security office and slammed the door shut behind me. Silence. I pressed my forehead against the cool metal, my entire body trembling. The camera monitors flickered, the grainy footage rolling through various parts of the opera house. The main stage was empty. The rehearsal room showed nothing but the grand piano, its lid open like a hungry mouth. The stairwell I had just fled from, still unmoving. Then the screen glitched. For a fraction of a second, I saw something. A shape. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its fingers stretched unnaturally toward the ceiling. Its head was tilted, as if listening. And then, just as fast, the screen returned to normal. A sharp knock came at the office door. I jerked back, my pulse thundering. The knock came again, 3 times, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. No one else was supposed to be here. Not at this hour. Not unless Graham. I hesitated, then reached for the handle with a shaking hand. The second I turned the knob, he shoved his way inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. "You ran," he said. My throat was too dry to respond. I nodded. Graham let out a slow breath and rubbed his temples. "You're lucky." His voice was hoarse. "If you'd hesitated, even for a second." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It doesn't like when people break the rules." I swallowed hard. What was that thing?" Graham didn't answer. He just walked to the monitors, his gaze scanning the screens. His jaw tightened. "It's awake now." I didn't know what he meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rest of my shift passed in tense silence. I stayed in the office, staring at the monitors, watching the empty halls, waiting for something, anything to move. But nothing did. By the time the first hints of dawn crept through the opera house windows, the building seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened, as if I had imagined it all. I quit the next morning, or at least I tried to. I didn't even make it home before my phone rang. The number was unknown. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to answer, but some deep, awful instinct told me I had to. I pressed the phone to my ear. A familiar voice whispered through the speaker, "You shouldn't have answered." The line went dead. A cold dread washed over me. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly at the road ahead. Then, my phone buzzed again. A text message this time. "Come back tonight. You don't have a choice." I turned off my phone and drove home. I told myself I wasn't going back, that I'd block the number, ignore the calls. But the moment night fell, a pressure built in my chest. A weight. Like something unseen was waiting for me to make a decision. By 10 p.m., I was back at the opera house. Graham was waiting at the entrance. He didn't look surprised, just tired. "You tried to leave," he said. I nodded. He sighed. "We all did." I wanted to ask what he meant, why we couldn't leave. But deep down I already knew. Something in this place had its claws in me now. The shift started the same as always. The opera house was quiet, the vast rooms filled with nothing but the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I forced myself to follow the rules to the letter. But then, around midnight, the cameras flickered. The main hall. A woman stood on the upper balcony. Her back was turned to the camera, long dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She wore a red dress. The fabric shimmered under the dim emergency lighting, unnaturally bright against the surrounding darkness. Rule number 4. Do not make eye contact. I swallowed hard. My hands were clammy as I gripped the desk. The monitor flickered again, just for a second, and when the image returned, she was facing the camera. I sucked in a sharp breath. Her face was wrong. Not blurred, not shadowed, just wrong. The proportions were off. Her mouth stretched a little too wide, her eyes too dark, too empty. And even though it was just a grainy security feed, I could tell she was looking at me. A knock came from the hallway. Not the office door, the hallway, the long corridor outside where no one should have been. My breathing hitched. I didn't move. The knock came again, slow, rhythmic, closer than before. I turned back to the monitor. The woman in the red dress was no longer on the balcony. The knocking stopped. A notification popped up on the screen. Backstage camera, feed lost. My stomach twisted. The security office was just past the backstage area. Something was coming, and it knew exactly where to find me. The air in the security office thickened, pressing in on me like invisible hands closing around my throat. The monitor flickered again, static rippling across the screen before cutting to black. Backstage camera, feed lost. My heart hammered. I couldn't see what was coming, but I felt it. A presence moving through the dark, unseen but undeniable. The air shifted outside the office door, the same way it had in the stairwell before I ran. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something watching, waiting. A slow creak echoed from the hallway, a single dragging footstep. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't look, don't acknowledge it, don't break the rule. Another footstep. Closer. My body screamed at me to move, but my muscles locked. The door was shut. The lights were on. I was inside the one place in the opera house that was supposed to be safe. Another step, then another. The knocking started again, but this time, it wasn't rhythmic. It was erratic, desperate, like something was trying to get in. Then came the whisper. So quiet I almost thought I imagined it. A voice just beyond the door. The words were garbled, slurred, as if spoken by a mouth that had never learned how. I see you. A sharp gasp clawed up my throat, but I clamped my hand over my mouth, forcing myself to stay silent. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. A slow scratch dragged down the door, a fingernail or something worse tracing a deliberate path along the metal. Then silence. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Nothing. I forced myself to reach for the monitor controls, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the mouse. The screen flickered back on. Backstage was empty. The woman in red dress was gone. I exhaled shakily, my body sagging against the chair. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had just been a test, a warning. The emergency lights in the hallway went out. The security office door unlocked. A sharp metallic click, loud in the silence. The cold realization hit me like a punch to the chest. It was inside. I scrambled to my feet, every instinct in me screaming to run. But where? There was only one exit, and whatever had been knocking was right outside. A second click. The door handle turned. I lunged forward, slamming my weight against the door just as it pushed inward. The force behind it was inhuman, sending a sharp jolt of pain through my shoulder as I tried to keep it shut. Then, a voice. But this time, it wasn't the whisper. It wasn't the garbled, slurred mess from before. It was clear, and it said my name. My stomach twisted. I knew that voice. It was Graham. "Let me in," he said. I hesitated. My grip on the handle faltered. Another push. The door jolted inward an inch before I caught it. "It's me," he insisted, his voice strained. "Open the door." I swallowed hard. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But something wasn't right. The opera house had rules. Rule number 5, if someone you know knocks after midnight, do not open the door. It is not them. My pulse pounded, my grip tightened. Say something only Graham would know. Silence. Then, in a perfectly calm, perfectly human voice, he said, "You tried to quit yesterday." My blood ran cold. It wasn't him. I shoved my full weight against the door, fighting the thing on the other side. For a second, it stopped. Then, it laughed. A low, breathy chuckle. The sound of something amused. The lights flickered back on. The pressure on the door vanished. I waited, my breath hitching, my entire body shaking. Seconds passed. Then minutes. I didn't move until the first hints of dawn crept through the opera house windows. When I finally found the courage to check the hallway, it was empty. The air was still. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was the faint scratch marks running down the security office door. I didn't go home that morning. I didn't even think about quitting again. I found Graham in the break room, his face drawn, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded. His eyes darkened. "She knocked, didn't she?" I hesitated. "She?" Graham inhaled sharply through his nose. "The woman in red. She knocks on every new employee's door, and she always speaks in a voice you trust." A chill rolled through me. What happens if someone opens it? Graham didn't answer. His silence stretched between us like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. He didn't have to say what happened if someone opened the door. The answer was already there, lurking in his hollow stare, in the way his fingers gripped the coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. Whatever he had seen, whatever he had lost, was something he could never take back. A slow dread settled into my bones. I had come so close. Too close. If I had hesitated even a second longer, if I had let doubt creep in, I would have opened that door, and then I wouldn't be standing here. Or worse, I would, but I wouldn't be me. A sharp clang echoed from somewhere deep in the opera house, rattling through the walls like a dying breath. My stomach twisted. The sun was rising, but the weight of the night still clung to the building like a curse. Graham exhaled, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not over." I turned to him, my mouth dry. "What do you mean?" His gaze flicked toward the hallway. "She came for you last night. That means she's not done." I swallowed hard, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. "How long does it last?" Graham's lips pressed into a thin line. "Depends." "On what?" His jaw tightened. "On whether she likes you." A shiver crawled down my spine. "And if she does?" Graham finally looked at me then, his expression grim. "Then she'll come back." The unease coiled in my stomach like a snake. I wanted to believe the worst was over, that I had passed whatever sick test the opera house had thrown at me. But the way Graham looked at me, like I was already marked, told me otherwise. The next night, I felt it before I even walked through the doors. A shift in the air, a weight pressing against my chest. The opera house wasn't empty. It was waiting. I hesitated outside the entrance, gripping my security badge so tightly my fingers ached. The wind howled through the streets, carrying a distant sound that sent ice through my veins. Knocking, not from the building, not from anywhere visible. But it was there, carried through the air like a warning. I forced myself inside, locking the doors behind me. The lobby was still, the grand chandeliers casting long, skeletal shadows against the marble floor. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to the security office. I half expected Graham to be there, waiting for me. But when I pushed open the door, the room was empty. Only the monitors flickered in the dim light. I checked the feeds, my breath catching in my throat. The woman in red was standing on the stage. Not moving, not knocking, just standing. Her face was still obscured by the grainy camera quality, but her dress looked even richer tonight, like the velvet had deepened in color, soaked in something wet. I didn't move, neither did she. The screen glitched. For a fraction of a second, the camera feed jumped forward, and suddenly, she wasn't standing anymore. She was facing the camera. My stomach dropped. I knew this angle. It was the backstage security camera. She wasn't on the stage anymore. She was closer. The screen flickered again. I braced myself. She had moved. She was in the hallway outside the security office. My breath hitched. My eyes darted to the door, my ears straining for any sound. The room was silent, but I knew better than to trust silence. The monitor flickered. I squeezed my fists. Don't look. Don't acknowledge her. Don't break the rule. A slow, deliberate knock came from the other side of the door. I clenched my jaw so tight I thought my teeth might crack. Another knock. Then another. Then a whisper. "I see you." I squeezed my eyes shut. "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." The whisper came again, closer, almost inside the room. "I see you." A soft tap against the desk. I couldn't breathe. The monitors flickered, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I forced myself to open my eyes. The screen was empty. The hallway was empty. The only proof that something had been there was the faint imprint of red fabric on the floor just outside the door, like someone had been standing there for hours. I didn't sleep that morning. I didn't even try. Graham didn't show up for his shift. I called. He didn't answer. The next night, I came back to work with a sinking feeling in my gut. Something wasn't right. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The weight, the expectation. The opera house knew me now. It wasn't letting me go. I had walked through these halls 100 times before, but tonight felt different. The silence wasn't empty. It was crowded. A presence lurked just beyond my vision, pressing against the edges of the dark, curling through the air like unseen fingers. I didn't call for Graham this time. I already knew he wasn't coming back. The security office felt wrong, stale, as if the walls had absorbed something rotten, something sick. My stomach twisted as I sat down, eyes locked on the monitors. Every camera was frozen. The feeds weren't dead. The images were just stuck. The empty lobby, the dimly lit corridors, the grand stage. But they weren't quite right. The chandeliers in the lobby looked brighter than they should have been. The chairs in the auditorium weren't in the usual arrangement. And the stage was occupied. A figure stood there mid-motion as if frozen in time. A man dressed in an old-fashioned tuxedo. His head was tilted back unnaturally, his mouth open in a silent scream. I blinked. His head snapped forward. Not a gradual movement, not a glitch. Just there, suddenly, staring at the camera, staring at me. My heart slammed against my ribs. This wasn't a recording. He was watching me. I swallowed, my throat dry as sandpaper. The screen flickered. The man was closer now. No transition, no movement, just closer. His mouth still open, stretched too wide, the corners pulled into something between agony and a grin. The air crackled around me. A low, distant hum filled the room, like 1,000 whispers layered over one another, just below the edge of hearing. The screen flickered again. He was gone. The hum stopped. A sharp knock came from the hallway. My stomach plummeted. The knock came again. Not urgent, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate tap against the wooden doorframe. I held my breath. The security office door was open. Not all the way, just enough for me to see the sliver of hallway beyond. I hadn't left it open. I never left it open. I reached for my flashlight with a shaking hand, but the moment my fingers brushed the handle, a shadow passed by the doorway. Not walking, sliding. Too fast, too smooth. I jerked back, my pulse hammering in my ears. My lungs felt too tight, my skin cold with a thin sheen of sweat. Something rustled in the hallway. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the knocking returned, not from the hallway, from inside the room, a slow, measured tap against the desk, right beside me. My skin crawled. I forced my head forward, staring straight at the monitors, refusing to look. Don't acknowledge it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't. The knock came again, harder this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of the desk until my fingers ached. A sharp breath. Not mine. Close. Too close. Right against my ear. I see you. The monitors glitched violently, the images warping, distorting, faces appearing in the static, twisted and blurred, mouths gaping as if screaming. Then, silence. I opened my eyes. The screen was clear. The office was empty. But the door was wide open now. A streak of something dark ran along the floor outside. Thick, wet. Leading down the hall, a sound rose in the distance, a deep, rattling breath. In, out, in, out. I followed the trail. I didn't want to. My body screamed at me to run the other way, but something else pulled me forward. The breath grew louder. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the shadows creeping in at the edges. The air thickened, pressing against my skin like a living thing. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hall, not moving, just waiting. The man from the stage, his head tilted back again, mouth still open, but now there was sound, a deep, guttural moan, like something trying to speak through broken vocal cords. My breath hitched. I took a step back. He took a step forward. My vision swam. My limbs locked. Another step. His mouth widened. The moan turned to a low, bubbling laugh. I turned and ran. The opera house shifted around me, the walls narrowing, the air pressing down like a suffocating hand. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but the sound followed me. The laughter, the footsteps, too many footsteps. The security office was ahead. I lunged inside, slamming the door behind me, silence. The monitors flickered. My hands shook as I checked the feeds. The hallways were empty. But the stage wasn't. The man was there again, and he wasn't alone. Figures stood beside him now, dozens, maybe hundreds, all dressed in faded costumes, all standing still, and then, in perfect unison, they turned their heads toward the camera, toward me. The screen cut to static. Then, through the speakers, a voice, "We've been waiting for you." The words crawled through the speakers, thick and wet, like something ancient whispering from deep inside a throat that no longer remembered how to speak. My pulse pounded in my ears. The security office walls felt like they were closing in, the air pressed too tight against my skin, thick with something I couldn't name. The monitors were a sea of static now, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. A flicker on the screen. The static wavered, shifted, and through the distortion, a face pushed forward, not on the stage, not in the halls, in the room with me. The screen barely held its shape, but I could make out the features, stretched too long, the mouth yawning open, the skin rippling as if something underneath was pressing against it. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the speakers. It was right behind me. "You shouldn't have come back." I spun in my chair. The office was empty, but the door wasn't. The hallway beyond the threshold wasn't the same hallway I had just run through. It was wrong. Darker, longer. The walls slanted inward like a tunnel leading somewhere it shouldn't. And the floor wasn't solid anymore. A thick, pulsing blackness oozed across the tiles, swallowing the light, shifting like something alive. I tried to move, my body wouldn't listen. A sound started low and deep, rattling through the walls like something massive breathing beneath the floors. The blackness pulsed in time with it, expanding, retracting, growing. I stepped back, my heel hitting the desk, and then the lights died. Total darkness, thick, absolute. My breath hitched in my throat, the air suddenly too cold, like I had stepped into something dead and hollow. Then movement, not footsteps, not shuffling, sliding. Something was coming through the door, pouring in. I clamped my hand over my mouth, choking down the scream building in my throat. The darkness pressed closer, suffocating, writhing. And then, from the black, hands, too many, crawling from the shadows, fingers stretching, twisting, reaching for me. Long, wrong, knuckles bending the wrong way, skin too pale, nails too black. The whisper came again from everywhere and nowhere, curling around me like a breath on the back of my neck. "You've already started to change." The fingers brushed my ankle. I kicked backward, slamming into the desk, scrambling for something, anything, to fight back. My hand hit metal, the flashlight. I snatched it up and clicked it on. The hands vanished, but the hallway remained. No longer the same opera house I had known. Now it was something else, something waiting. The stage lights flickered on, not from the monitors, from outside the office. Down that impossible hallway, through the tunnel of pulsing dark, I could see it now, the stage. The figures were still there, but now they were moving. Their limbs jerked in unnatural motions, heads twisting at impossible angles. Their mouths gaped, stretching wider and wider, and in the center of them all, the man in the tuxedo. His arms spread wide as if welcoming me. And then, as one, they all began to step forward. I ran. I didn't care where, I just ran. The hallway stretched longer with every step, the walls bending, shifting. The floor wasn't solid anymore, sinking beneath my feet like I was running through something thick and alive. Behind me, the sound followed. The shuffling, the laughter, the whispering voices all speaking in tandem, forming words that weren't meant for human tongues. I rounded a corner, and the doors to the main auditorium loomed ahead. They were wide open, and beyond them, the stage waited. No, I wasn't going in there. I turned and froze. The hallway was gone. Only darkness remained. I had no choice. I stepped into the auditorium. The stage lights burned brighter. The figures stood in perfect formation now, heads tilted, eyes locked onto me. And then they opened their mouths. A sound poured out, a scream that wasn't a scream, a chorus of distorted inhuman wails, twisting through the air like a living thing. The chandeliers above rattled violently, dust and glass raining down as the walls trembled. And the man, the one in the tuxedo, he raised his hand. The figures surged forward. I turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls melted away, replaced by something vast, endless, black. The opera house was gone. I wasn't inside a building anymore. I was inside something else, something living, something that had been waiting for me for a very long time. And in the distance, through the endless black, a new voice spoke. Not a whisper, not a moan. Something deeper, older. "You've finally come home." The words sank into my bones, deeper than sound, deeper than thought, like they had been waiting there all along. The darkness breathed around me. It pulsed, alive, shifting like the walls of a lung, inhaling, exhaling. The opera house was gone, and in its place was something endless, something wrong. The stage still loomed ahead, bathed in a sickly yellow glow, but the figures were different now. They weren't just standing, they were changing. Their limbs stretched unnaturally, their heads tilting further back than human anatomy should allow. The mouths, they weren't mouths anymore, just gaping holes, expanding, swallowing the light. And the man in the tuxedo? He was walking toward me. His movements were slow, deliberate, his feet not touching the ground. He moved too smoothly, like he was gliding through water. His face, God, his face. The skin was pulled too tight, his smile stretching past his cheeks, almost splitting his face in half. He raised a hand. Not a hand anymore, a mass of fingers, twisting and writhing like worms beneath his skin. "You were never supposed to leave." The words weren't spoken. They throbbed through the space around me, vibrating in my skull, pressing against my ribs. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness behind me had solidified, a wall of pulsing, wet blackness that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I wasn't trapped inside this place. I was part of it. The figures on the stage took a step forward, all at once. Their heads twitched in perfect synchronization, mouths still gaping wide, bodies convulsing as if something inside them was trying to get out. The man in the tuxedo raised his other hand, and the walls of the world collapsed. I was falling. Not down, not up, just falling. Through layers of something that wasn't time, wasn't space, but something older. I saw flashes as I fell. Visions. The opera house, long before it was abandoned. The audience, packed in tight, staring up at the stage with blank eyes. The performers, moving in slow, jerking motions. Not dancing, not acting, obeying. And beneath the stage, the heart of it all. A mouth. A vast, endless mouth, stretching through the very foundation of the theater, breathing, waiting. The opera house wasn't just a building. It was a gate, and I had opened it. The fall stopped so suddenly, my bones rattled. I was back in the auditorium, but it wasn't an auditorium anymore. It was a cathedral of flesh. The seats were gone. The chandeliers had melted into dripping tendrils of black sinew, pulsing, twitching. The stage was wider now, stretching impossibly far, curving at the edges like the inside of a great yawning mouth. The figures, they weren't human anymore. Their bodies had split open, twisted into grotesque shapes. Too many limbs, too many joints, bending at angles that made my stomach turn. They weren't moving anymore. They were waiting. The man in the tuxedo stood at the center of it all, arms outstretched, his eyes black pits of endless hunger. Sing for us. The words poured through me like cold water, slithering into my skull, filling my throat. And then I felt it, the pressure in my chest, the thing inside me stirring. I staggered, hands clawing at my throat. My skin, it was too loose, shifting over muscle that wasn't mine. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body shaking. I looked down at my hands, they were stretching. My fingers elongated, skin splitting at the tips as new, blackened nails pushed through. No, this wasn't real. I tried to scream, but the voice that came out wasn't mine. It was theirs. The chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, pouring from my throat in a song that was never meant for human ears. The figures began to move again, swaying in time with the sound. The walls quivered, the great black tendrils above contracting, expanding, feeding. I clenched my teeth, fighting it. I wasn't part of this. I wasn't like them. But the tuxedoed man was already smiling wider. You've always been one of us. The pressure inside me grew. My ribs creaked, my skin stretched, my throat burned with the force of something clawing its way out. I was changing, becoming one of them. No, I refused. I forced my mouth shut, bit down so hard I tasted blood. The song faltered, the figures twitched violently, their movements growing erratic. The tuxedoed man's smile flickered. Good. I used everything I had left, one final surge of willpower. I turned, and I ran. I didn't know where. There was no door, no exit. But I ran anyway, forcing my body forward, away from the stage, away from the man, away from the thing I was becoming. The world ripped apart around me. The stage lights exploded, the walls shattered, and the ground beneath me gave way. I was falling again. But this time, I woke up. The cold floor of the security office pressed against my cheek, the monitors flickered, and the opera house was silent. I gasped, scrambling to my feet, my hands flying to my throat. Normal. My skin, normal. I turned to the monitors. The stage was empty, the figures gone. I didn't wait. I bolted from the office, through the hallways, through the main doors. Out into the cold night air where the world was real again. I never went back, but sometimes, at night, I still hear it. The song calling me home.